Fascism is on the rise in America, and there is no one better to discuss it with than Heather Cox Richardson. This was recorded before a live premium Democracy Docket audience. Become a member now to make sure you are included in future premium events. Heather Cox Richardson, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for everything you're doing, Mark. We need you.
So you are an inspiration to so many of us, and we're going to talk about your writings and your Substack and your Facebook and everything. But I actually want to start with a book you wrote about the history of the Republican Party. And for people who don't know, Heather is one of the foremost scholars in the Civil War and the beginning of the Republican Party, but also its evolution over time. So Heather, let me just ask you, how do you think of the modern Republican Party against the various iterations it went through? People always say, well, it was the party of Lincoln, and then they jump to MAGA and Donald Trump. There were several way stations along the way. There was the Hoover Republican Party before the New Deal. There was the anti-New Deal Republican Party. There was, in my professional career, when I first started doing politics, there was the Reagan Revolution Republican Party, then the Gingrich Revolution Republican Party. Talk to us as a historian how you think about the Republican Party and where we are now.
To understand the Republican Party, it helps to think of it as a pendulum because the party has really gone through three major swings in its history. And what happens is it starts from a position of believing in equal rights, equal access to resources, and the idea that everybody should have a say in the government. And you can see that under Abraham Lincoln, under Theodore Roosevelt, and under Dwight Eisenhower. And I'm not talking about Democrats here at all, which we could do because they fit in a very different way. But if you start there, what happens is that the party tends to really push the idea of equality and equal rights and a say in the government and equal access to resources. And almost immediately, it faces an anti-immigrant, racist, sexist, depending on which area you're in, backlash. And when that happens, when you get that backlash, we could talk about where the backlash comes from, the party tends to double down on big business. It needs money to win elections, so it doubles down on big business. And when that happens, it starts to push laws and policies that concentrate wealth in the very top of the economy. And then there tends to be a dramatic economic crash. And when that happens, the party ends up in the wilderness and it rebuilds itself from a position of embracing the idea of equality and having a say in your government, having equal access to resources. Now, when I wrote the book you're talking about, which was almost exactly 11 years ago, came out in 2014 in September. When I wrote that book, I was really trying to push the Republican lawmakers and leaders to step in and stop going the direction they were going with the Republican Party, because it looked to me like they were going in a very bad direction. And what was funny was that a lot of the people who were affiliated with the Republicans were furious about that book. They felt that I'd been much too hard on the Republican Party and I was way exaggerating their racism and their sexism, and this was ridiculous that I was so far out there. And I feel like they all owe me an apology, can I just say? But that sort of buildup is what gave us Donald Trump. But then he did something new. And that was after the Unite the Right rally in August of 2017, he walked away pretty much because he had to from those sort of oligarchical Republican leaders who were at the far end of the pendulum swing, and used the foot soldiers he was building to create an authoritarian movement. And that's new. That's something new that we're seeing in the Republican Party. We certainly have seen hints of that in our history, most dramatically among the Democrats in the 19th century American South. But that's new for the Republican Party. So we're really in uncharted waters now.
Do
Now you don't
you
have to read the book.
Yeah, it's a great book, and we're going to put a link to it in the show notes. Do you see a through line? I do, but I wonder if it's just because it like spans my career. Do you see a through line between the Gingrich Republican Party and Donald Trump, with the Tea Party in between, or are those really were those separate movements?
Oh, no, no, no. This is absolutely a line. And you think about the evolution of political parties. It's really they don't shift suddenly. People's ideas build on ideas. And the Gingrich Revolution in the 90s very much built on the takeover of the Republican Party by the movement conservatives from the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And those were the people who called themselves conservatives because they were attempting to go back to the period before the New Deal. They wanted to go back to the 1920s, but they were not ideologically conservative. They were ideologically really radical. So they became known as movement conservatives because they were a political movement with the name conservative. And what they were trying to do, as I say, is to go back to the 1920s and get rid of business regulation and taxation and a basic social safety net and public funding of infrastructure and the protection of civil rights. They wanted to get rid of all those things. Now they take over the party beginning in 1964 and then really taking off in 68 after the Voting Rights Act of 65. And Reagan really nods to them in the 1980s, but by the time you get Gingrich in the 1990s, what he does is he keeps calling anybody who's a traditional Eisenhower type Republican who wants all the same things that I just listed and the same things that Democrats want, although in slightly different ways. He calls all those people Republicans in name only, or rhinos. It's exactly backward. They're the real Republicans. He's a rhino. He's a radical, but he's very good with language. He uses that language that way. And once he has purged the party or begun the purge of the party of those traditional Republicans, the movement conservatives take the party over and they really push through their anti-regulation, anti-tax. That's really their first two pillars, but then the social conservatism and all those pieces of their movement. They push those things through by bringing into the party the sexists and the racists that had previously been actually before the 60s in the Democratic Party. And when they do that and take over that party, they really tee up Donald Trump, who talks in 2016 about the economy and making it work for everybody, but jettisons that really quickly and doubles down on the culture wars and the racism and sexism. So he is something new, but he was 100% set up by the movement conservatives, by the Gingrich Revolution and the Reagan Revolution before that, and by William F. Buckley Jr. before that, and by the what was called the Conservative Manifesto of 1937 that outlines the platform we're seeing being put in place right now.
Okay, let's talk about voting and the Voting Rights Act, because in this frame of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, obviously the Voting Rights Act gets put forward by a Democratic president, but has, as I recall, as I understand it, bipartisan support. Is, I think, more regional differences than partisan differences at the time. And then it is reauthorized and expanded under a series of Republican presidents, basically with overwhelming congressional majorities. In the 2006, it's 98-0 in the Senate. There were 33 no votes in the House. I think in 1982, when Reagan reauthorized it, it was also a very large majorities. And actually, the Voting Rights Act was expanded in 1982. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, they added the effects test, which has been critically important to it. So, and the final thing I'll add by way of context for folks watching this is that in 2006, it is actually the business community, it is the CEO of Walmart and the Business Roundtable that are really go to bat to push reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. Help us understand how we wind up in a world now in which every Republican votes against the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in 2020 and 2021, and that now it seems like Republicans are not just hostile to the Voting Rights Act, but doing away with it is part of their program. Is this just a historical? Like, I've heard some people say, well, Republicans never really liked it, but they kind of felt like they had to go along with it. But that can't be the entire story.
No, and that's also not right. You think about the Eisenhower Republicans, they really were in favor of it when the Democrats weren't. The parties are pretty malleable in the 20th century, and the constant arguments you hear of, the Republicans have never changed and the Democrats have never changed are just completely ahistorical. So there are a couple of ways, I think, to think about why there is such an attack on the Voting Rights Act. And I do want to point out that while an attack on this specific law is new because the law itself is only about 60 years old, that the idea of making a country where most people can't vote is not new at all. And we have seen the expansion of voting in the late 19th century and its retraction after that, and that would be Reconstruction. And you get the period from about 1874 to 1965 when Black Americans, Brown Americans, and women, for the most part, are not able to vote in the American South. The women is a little bit dicier after the 19th Amendment in 1920, but there is the construction of a body politic in which most people can't participate. And we know what comes from that is not a purer electorate, which is what people argued at the time and are arguing today. What comes from that is an incredibly corrupt one-party system that is almost impossible to create any kind of a vibrant economy or any kind of safety in because it is controlled by cronies. So we have done this before. So you can look at it that way, or you can look at the more immediate time. And what we're seeing, I really think, since 1974 is a good moment to pick because you've got, again, coming up very quickly now, Ford's pardon of Nixon after Watergate. You have the idea in 74 that country still comes before party. And one of the things that the movement conservatives did is they were convinced that they were the only true Americans. Their desire to destroy the modern American state was the only version they believed of true Americanism. And anybody who wanted to have a government that, regulated business, had taxes, protected civil rights, promoted infrastructure, and provided a basic social safety net. Anybody who thought that way in their minds was a communist now or a socialist. Now, they were able to work in the United States with those people really until the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. And with that collapse of the Soviet Union, those movement conservatives quite vocally said, we are now going to turn our firepower on the socialists in our midst, and they don't have nuclear weapons. That's a direct quote from from an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And what you saw really taking off, again, with Gingrich and going forward, was the deliberate division of this country into the movement conservatives and everybody else. And when they said liberals, they weren't referring to Democrats. They were referring to anybody who believed in that modern American state. And you saw the beginning of that polarization really taking off under Nixon. He called it positive polarization because it would drive Republicans to the polls. So they thought it was a good thing. Reagan certainly uses it, but Newt Gingrich puts it on steroids. So by the late 1990s, you're starting to see a world in which Republicans, having been taken over by this faction, believe that they are the only people who have the right to govern. And that if people elect Democrats, it must only be because the Democrats are cheating. So when you get the Motor Voter Act in 1993, immediately after that in 94, you get the Republicans challenging a couple of Democratic victories on the grounds of voter fraud,
Absolutely.
even though there's no evidence of that. Remember that?
I do. I was involved in some of those were my earliest election contests were in the House in 1994. Yeah.
And then, and there was one in the Senate as well. And then after that, you increasingly get this Republican position that they're only losing because Democrats are cheating. And with that idea, that quickly becomes the Democrats have no right to hold office. And of course, we get the 2000 Miami-Dade recount in Florida and the Brooks Brothers riot. But then when voters elect Barack Obama in 2008, which was supposed to be completely impossible, we get a number of things. We get the Operation Red Map that so dramatically gerrymanders all the Republican-dominated states. We get Citizens United, and then in 2013, we get the attack on voting rights with the Shelby versus Holder decision. And increasingly, you see Republicans insisting that Democrats do not have the right to rule. And so then when you get to 2020 and the voters once again elect a Democrat, you literally see Republicans saying that this cannot possibly be right and working to overturn a legitimate election. And I think you're seeing it again right now. I think Trump has no intention of ever letting a Democrat hold office. And what really interests me about it historically is this is exactly the language that the former Confederates used in 1898 when they overturned a free and fair election in North Carolina.
Right.
And that we always used to identify as, our great American coup. Well, now it looks like small potatoes compared to where we are. But that idea that they literally said, listen, these people were elected, but we will never be elected by these sorts of people. We will never be represented by these sorts of people again. So we're just going to chase them out of office with guns. And that the recurrence of that language from Reconstruction in the present is, I think, really instructive because it says where the mindset is of those people, but it also suggests ways to push back against it.
Yeah. So it's really interesting what you say about the rise of this notion among Republicans and on the right that there are no Democratic victors that are legitimate because, in 1996, the first statewide election contest I was involved in was representing was representing Democrats in the Senate. It was a different structure back then. The contests were actually in the chambers, and that was the Landrew Jenkins
Yeah.
contest, where Woody Jenkins, the candidate, the Republican who lost, made these fancifully outlandish claims that there were what he referred to as phantom votes. It was very sort of alliterative at the time that, conjuring up this idea that there were these mysterious votes that came out of nowhere when there was just no evidence of it. Obviously, in 1998, I represented Senator Reid, Harry Reid of Nevada, who won a close election. And again, there was this effort to delegitimize this election that somehow the labor unions had gotten involved and had done something untoward. Then, obviously, the 2000 election you mentioned, in 2008, Norm Coleman contested the Minnesota election all the way till July. Just like the state of Minnesota didn't have representation in the U.S. Senate, and Democrats didn't have a 60th vote until you get to July of 2009. We have seen it in the years since then. They contested, people don't remember this, they contested Roy Cooper's gubernatorial election, his first gubernatorial election, obviously the most recent North Carolina state Supreme Court election. And it is always using the same, and then obviously the 2020 election where, I represented President Biden. And what's interesting in all of those where I was representing the Democrat, you had the same rhetoric. The slight claims changed. Sometimes it was mail-in voting they were complaining about. Sometimes it was machines. But it was always the idea that somehow Democrats had cheated. And I always, it's interesting having this conversation with you because I always wondered, why didn't they just try to add more lawful votes? Why was it always they were always in the business of vote subtraction, saying that there were these illegal votes. And I always wondered, why don't they say, what, there were votes that should have been counted that weren't, but they never do that.
Well, but that I think is incredibly important for understanding where we are now. They can't add votes because what they are doing is not popular.
Right.
That's why they don't want Democrats to vote because their policies are so dramatically unpopular that if you have a lot of people voting, we know the Democrats are going to win. In a free and fair election, the Democrats are going to sweep everything right up. And so that attempt to pick their voters, both through gerrymandering and through voter suppression and so on, has created a smaller and a smaller and a smaller and a smaller pie. It's also created a more radical pie so that the Republicans are, if you look at any political science chart, it will show you that the Democratic Party really has stayed pretty much where it always was. The Republicans have jumped off the cliff. And again, from a political science perspective, and I'm a historian, by the way, not a political scientist, but I do read political science. From a political science perspective, This is absolutely murder on the Republican Party as well as on the Democratic Party, because what's going to happen is they've gone so far now that the backlash, when it hits, is going to get rid of gerrymandering. It's going to get rid of voter suppression and so on. And the snapback is going to leave the Republicans crying in the wilderness. It's an incredibly unhealthy place to be. And I think you can see that today with Trump trying all these different ways to try to make sure that only a handful of his choice supporters are going to be able to vote. Well, how long are 341 million Americans going to say, oh, yeah, that's okay. It's okay if you kick all these people off the vote? I think they've hit their wall.
So I want to ask you a question about um, what the pushback on all of this has looked like over time. I'm reminded that the reason we got the 26th Amendment was because it was included in I think, in the first round of reauthorizations to the Voting Rights Act, and it got struck down by court. And then the reaction was, okay, let's expand voting and lower the age. What we have seen now is a multi-year effort by the Republican Party itself, as literally the RNC and the Republican Party. Now we're seeing it from the Department of Justice and Pam Bondi. But we also see it among Donald Trump and his followers to, as you say, contract and contract and contract the electorate. What does the snapback to that look like?
So, it's interesting that you ask that now, because I'm watching this very closely, because to me it seems that the parallels of this moment are to the era of the 1880s and the
Okay.
1890s, especially the late 1890s, and the pushback against the robber barons. Because if you looked at the United States in, say, 1892, you would think that, or maybe 1890, you would think that the robber barons were going to walk away with everything. And yet, what happens is very quickly you get a response that creates the progressive era. And a number of things happen, some of which we identify pretty commonly and some of which we don't. One is the economic system is not benefiting the vast majority of Americans, and it's just not. I mean, we know that, and we know that one of the ways that Trump managed to get traction in 2016 was by promising he would represent the people who had been left behind by supply side economics, which, as we know, transferred at least $50 trillion from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. He said he was going to do it, but instead, what did he do? He cut tax cuts for the wealthy and he cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations. People were aware that they were not being helped economically. And so what does he do? He doubles down on the culture war stuff and the racism and the sexism. Now, once again, he managed to attack the Democrats in 2024, right? Yeah, 2024, by saying that the economy was terrible. And he really had the benefit of not having the independent media pushing back against him in a way that they are now, because he really badly misrepresented what was happening in the US economy. And now every time I read an article saying, well, we're losing this great thing, we're losing this great thing, I'm like, yeah, why didn't you say it was a great thing when it was happening? But so one of the things you're seeing is more and more Americans recognizing that the system that the very wealthy are putting in place is not serving them. This cabinet is absolutely full of billionaires. We know that cryptocurrency is creating the Trump family fortune. They were in real hard shape before they came into the White House the second time around. And now, as of Monday, the Trump family is worth $5 billion, at
I
least
know,
on
it's
paper.
amazing.
And as of today, Eric Trump, and I just stopped myself from saying something incredibly snarky. Eric Trump is worth $3.2 billion as of today because of the release of his new crypto coin. And, I think people look at that and recognize that they're losing their supplemental nutrition programs, they're losing their health care, the cuts to FEMA and to so on are really crippling people. So the first thing that I'm going to say there's not political. It's a recognition that the system is not enabling people to embrace the American dream. That new Wall Street Journal NORC poll that came out on Monday says that 70% of Americans do not think you can rise to success by working hard in the United States. That's the American dream destroyed in this moment, much as it was in the 1890s. But the other piece of it, I think, that we don't pay attention to is there's a generational change. There's a generational shift in the 1880s and the 1890s, and we're seeing the same thing now. And that generational shift matters in two ways. One, you get the second generation of former Confederates, for example, or Reagan Democrats, who truly believe the rhetoric that they're better than everybody else, that they have a right to rule. And that would be the sons of the Confederates in the 1890s, or I think probably we can think of some people in the present who are sons as well, right? So you get that radicalization of a certain group of people, but you also get those politicians and thinkers who would like to be elected to office, who would like to defend American democracy, who would like to be part of creating a better nation for one reason or another, who begin to articulate a new vision and to try and amass electoral support doing that. And this is where we get, for example, Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, Albert Beveridge in Indiana. He later kind of goes off on his own, but Albert, the younger generation of people who say, we care a lot about American democracy, and that means the rich guys shouldn't get everything. And one of the reasons I keep urging people to speak up is because it's the same thing that happened in the 1890s. A lot of people said, hey, this system is not working for us. We need to have a system that works for everyday Americans so that we are treated equally before the law, have a right to a say in our government, and have equal access to resources. And when people hear that and pick that up because they want to get elected, you start to see a sea change. Now, what does that mean? I'm looking at Iowa, for example, where Joni Ernst has said yesterday that she is not going to run for reelection. That is a sign, I think, that she took to heart what just happened with that special election in Iowa, where there was a 21 point, I think, swing away from Donald Trump. Similarly, you see the rise of politicians like Graham Plattner here in Maine. Nobody had heard of him 3 weeks ago, and he is embracing this new kind of language. And there's somebody else who just jumped into the race today, similarly. And when you start to
And
see,
Susan Collins is really unpopular. I mean,
yeah, she's
really
got 17% right now, but Mainers just don't like her. That doesn't mean they won't vote for her. But it does mean she may not run. It
Right.
may not be worth it to her to run again. But so anyway, so those things happen, and I think people begin to articulate a new way to think about American democracy, and it's popular. And when that happens, the country turns very, very quickly. Now, the trick will be, first of all, to make that happen, but second of all, to stop these damn pendulum swings, to lock it in so that we don't keep doing this, from one huge swing to another with all the trauma that goes on in between.
Okay. So I've got to ask you about something that feels very intuitively important to me. And I have tried to, um, I've talked about this. I've tried to sort of really emphasize it, but I don't think I'm I don't think I'm getting through, and I don't think, or I'm not getting the language right. I grew up in New York. We learned about the Civil War. There was good guys, bad guys, war over slavery. And the bad guys were preaching for states' rights. But now I find myself telling Democratic governors, the public, that that we live in a in a system of federalism, and Democrats are not as comfortable talking about federalism. So help me here. I recently on a podcast said that the states predated the Constitution, and in fact, the Constitution was created by the states. I was corrected by a progressive constitutional lawyer that no, that isn't right, that the people created the Constitution. So help me, is my intuition about federalism and states' rights just off base? Or is there a role here for the states to be pushing back against the federal government without adopting what is a sordid history of such efforts? I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Heather Cox Richardson in a moment. I started Democracy Docket in 2020 to cover the fight for voting rights that is happening in courtrooms around the country. And we do these premium events with our members in order to give them a chance to interact and ask questions of me and our guests. So please become a premium member now to support Democracy Docket's 20-person team in providing you the news that matters to democracy, and also to get access to future exclusive events.
Well, there's a lot that just got tangled up in there. Let's the fact that the states did not construct the Constitution. The states constructed the Articles of Confederation, which are the precursor to the Constitution, and the framers chucked that baby right out because it was rapidly the country was falling apart, and created the Constitution, which deliberately does not say the states are constructing the government. It says we the people.
Right.
And that actually has a lot of really major implications. But so that's the difference between the two. The states created the articles, they didn't work. The people created the Constitution, it did for the most part. But the question of federalism, which is the relationship between a national government and state governments in the United States, is fascinating and I think really important in this moment, because the actual construction of the idea of states having rights is rooted in the 18, well, really right after the Constitution begins, but it really takes off in the 1830s
Right.
with the idea that those states who don't agree with what the federal government is doing can nullify those things and can create their own kinds of government. And that was very deliberately self-serving on the part of people like before he was President Andrew Jackson, who was trying to defend enslavement and the idea of making sure that even though the southern states did not have the kinds of electoral power that the northern states did, that they would be able to continue to enslave their neighbors. So the roots of states' rights lie in an ugly place. That being said, the actual use of states as laboratories for progressivism is as deeply rooted in our history as that reactionary thing I just described. So the way we get the idea of corporations, for example, and a federal regulation of corporations is from New York State in the early 19th century and the late 19th century, when New York is way ahead of everybody else on internal improvements. Think Erie Canal, 1825. That's astonishing. They dug that sucker with shovels. Right? And I mean, it was crazy, but they did it. And that was more than just making it easy for people to get from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. What that meant was that the Great Lakes states did not break off and join Canada, which they would have done because the only outlet for their goods ran through Canada or ran very close to Canada. By cutting that, what it really did is it protected the inner part of the United States for the United States. It was a really big deal. But then by the late 19th century, when the Republicans, who by then are embracing the robber barons, have taken over the federal government, it's the state governments, especially governments like Wisconsin, that become the laboratory. They're literally called laboratories for democracy. Wisconsin and again, New York. So if you look at New York State in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, you start to see the use of the state to have a social safety net, to have regulations on streetcars, to make sure people who have wealth pay their taxes. They really become laboratories for how to create a government that protects all of the people who live in that community. And a lot of people, when they think of the Democratic Party in the late 19th and early 20th century, think about the former Confederates who are running things in the American South. But the weight of the party by then is New York City. That's how we get Grover Cleveland, for example, or Tilden, who wins the 1870s, the popular vote in 1876. And in that government in New York, and most people aren't aware of this, the Democratic government in New York is protecting Black rights in the 1900s, which is bonkers, right? If you think about the Democratic Party, because you think of the National Party, the state party in New York is protecting Black rights and women's rights in the 1900s. And that is the basis on which we get the New Deal, because the New Dealers came directly out of Tammany Hall when Tammany Hall was not corrupt in those years, out of Tammany Hall in the early 20th century. So in this moment, if you think about states' rights versus the federal government, a very similar period, as I say, to the 1890s. I had to write about this, shouldn't I? Is to the 1890s. It only makes sense for the states to be saying, hey, we're not going to play the game the way you want to. So, for example, Florida today said it was going to stop requiring vaccines for public schools. a number of democratic states have said, hey, we're going to get together and make sure we have access to vaccines up
Yep.
here. And that the cooperation among the states is different than it has been before on the progressive side. But the idea that the states could be laboratories of democracy is very much a part of our history. And in fact, when you get the idea of federal mandates and the federal government forcing a state to do something it doesn't want to do, those were designed because the people in charge of the federal government thought that, of course, the states would want to have good education and good health care. So they would fund the states who were not doing that for them to catch up. But what it turned into, of course, was those states didn't want to do it and insisted that they were being forced to do things they didn't want to do. So that federal give and take is really important in our history, and absolutely people should be leaning into it.
All right. I want to make sure that people who have questions are putting those questions in the chat. We're going to turn to them in a minute or two. But while people put their questions in, I got to ask you, as someone who started Democracy Docket, as the idea that what we needed was independent pro-democracy media, you are sort of the titan in this field, right? You have the largest Substack by leaps and bounds. I think you have 3 million subscribers on Substack, and that's only part of the number of people who read your amazing content. How did you decide? Like, how did you sit down one day and say, you know what, I'm going to write letters. I'm going to write an open letter to the American people, and I'll just keep doing that.
Boy, that sounds like it was planned, doesn't it? I never did that. I had been writing on Facebook an essay about once a week or so,
Yeah.
and hadn't written since July 18th, almost exactly 6 years ago. I'm coming up on my sixth anniversary.
Okay, so July 18th of 2019.
19.
Okay.
And so on September 15th of that year, 2019, I was stung by a yellow jacket and I'm allergic and I didn't have my EpiPen. So while I sat swelling, I thought I ought to write to people who were concerned about the fact they hadn't heard from me in a while. I was moving, I was, doing a lot of other stuff. And so I sat down just to say, well, this is what America looks like to me today. And people flooded me with questions. I'm a teacher, so I, just said what I thought it looked like to me. And then they flooded me with questions. And I thought, well, I don't want to flood the zone and, speak up all the time. So I gave it 2 days. I wrote again on September 17th, and I've written every night since. And I am not a journalist. I am a historian. So I look at things in a different way than a journalist does. I'm looking for things that change society. And I've become a good writer, I think. I was a decent writer
You're an
before that.
excellent writer. You
Well,
are
I
an
think I've written
excellent
like
writer.
5 books then, or some, was finishing a book at the time. I guess I was finishing How the South Won. And but you're right. I've written millions of words now. I'm good, um, but mostly all I'm doing is trying to digest what's happening and explain why it matters to me. I mean, explain to me why it matters and what actually happened. And that I just think I'm not. I'm hoping to work myself out of a job. The day will come when people feel so empowered to do that themselves, they don't need me. But there's an awful lot that goes on that it's very, very difficult to untangle from the news. Like when the Trump administration tried to deport those children in the middle of
Yeah.
the night over the weekend, finding out what time they did that. I couldn't find that time until I actually found the judge's decision, where she actually wrote in that decision at what time she had been woken up by a phone call. And I feel like everything is overwhelming unless you understand it. But knowledge absolutely is power. And so long as you understand it, you can plan what to do next. So all I do is I try and make it so I understand what's happening, and then I share it. And if people ask me to talk about things, I'm happy to do that. To me, it's all one big journey that we're all on together. And that's why I always quote from other journalists, because I don't want it to make it look like I'm doing something brilliant. I'm just sort of saying this is what's happening and this is my understanding of it. And, please come along for the ride. And,
Yeah.
it seems to be useful.
So I have been very critical of um, the legacy media for failing to stand up and be clear-eyed. I've been very critical of big law firms for being unwilling to stand up and be clear-eyed. I've been so critical that I've almost given up on corporate America. There was a time when I thought they would actually be part of the solution, because what better nonpartisan source of counterbalance against Donald Trump could there possibly be than titans of industry? I mean, these are people's employers. They sell them products. They are important for culture. They're important for commerce. They tend to have very large egos. Like, I thought they might stand up, and I've become more than disillusioned by them. I think they're completely useless. I'm curious whether you share my skepticism. And it's okay if you don't, because there are people who say, I go too hard on the New York Times, or I go too hard on the Washington Post, or I go too hard on some of the legacy news outlets. What is your take on sort of the large institutions? I'm not going to ask you about academia. That wouldn't be fair. But you can talk about the media, law firms, and business.
Well, I'm happy to talk about those and universities, because I think the theme is the same that I see from all of them. I think they are all trying to hedge their bets as much as they possibly can. So while certainly many of the outlets you mentioned have seemed to kowtow to Trump, they also have extraordinarily hard-hitting journalists who are doing the actual work. And when CBS said it would not renew Stephen Colbert's contract, that was a really big deal.
Yeah.
Except they didn't shut him up the next day. They gave him 10 months to say anything he wanted. I mean, it seems to me like they are waiting to see which way the wind is going to blow. And maybe some are true believers, but mostly they're just hoping that they don't have to put their necks out. Now, I think that's what I see, because for everything you can see they've done wrong, you can see things they've done right, like the Wall Street Journal, for example, being the ones to break the story about the fact Trump was in the Epstein files. That came from the Wall Street Journal. They did a bunch of stuff recently. They backed off for a while and they did stuff again. But the piece that I am, and I get that, I'm offended by it, but I get it. The piece that infuriates me is the senators. I don't care. I mean, I do care what party you're in and all that, but as a senator, you have an obligation to defend the prerogatives of the Senate and of the Congress. You took an oath that you were going to do that. You took an oath that you were going to uphold the Constitution. Nobody forced them to do that. They didn't have to run for office. They did it. And then, when forced to confront the fact that a president of any party was taking away the rights of Congress and the rights of the Senate, they caved. They waited for the courts to take care of it, or they hoped it would go away. Now they're waiting for him to be unable to fill the office and go away. And for all that I get frustrated as you do about the institutions that you just mentioned, that one, the fact that they walked away from the prerogatives of the Senate, just fries me. I got nothing for that one.
Heather Cox Richardson, you are a national treasure. Everyone should make sure you are subscribed to Letters from an American, her Substack, which is wildly popular. Also, I highly recommend her books, and we're going to put the links to a couple of them in the description below. I want to thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark, and thank you for everything you're doing. It's all going to be a team effort, and I'm really proud to be on this team with you.
This was recorded before a live audience of Democracy Docket premium members. Sign up now to become a premium member so that you may be able to ask your question at the next one of our premium events.